Yep.
All right, so today is our last time going through the Old Testament prophets, which is super cool. It has been really fun for me. I know that there's so much to all of these, and I know that we've really just kind of scratched the surface on much of this conversation, but it's been fun for me just to kind of go back through and read. And it was a long time ago that I took an Old Testament survey class, which was kind of the last real deep dive I did for all of this altogether. So it's just been really fun to go back through it again. And so I pray that as you've been reading your word, or as you've been reading the New Testament and you're seeing references and calls back to the Old Testament prophets, that there's maybe more of a confidence or a familiarity, or even kind of an excitement for understanding, and it has been fruitful in that way. So we're going to start with the book of Haggai. So if any of you grew up in church and learned like songs for the books of the Bible, I've heard Haggai pronounced so many different ways, and I honestly think it's to make it like work with the song, to like, because I think the song that we learned growing up, it was like Haggai, just because you needed more more length to the name. But I believe the correct pronunciation is Haggai, just short and sweet. Haggai and Zechariah are kind of partners and contemporaries at the same time. So I kind of put in small letters up here, Ezra and Nehemiah are basically the narrative story of what's happening in the time of Haggai and Zechariah. So these moments really are intertwined into this story. And so these books obviously mention these guys and talk about things that happen. So like when we're reading, you'll read Haggai or Zechariah say something to the people, and then it'll say like, in this month of this year, this happened kind of thing. But it doesn't say what happened between those two moments. A lot of that is actually unpacked in Ezra and Nehemiah. Like, he said this and the people were rallied and they began to work on the temple again. It doesn't say any of that in the prophetic book, but it does say it in Ezra and Nehemiah. So anyhow, those are really fun books to read and to go through, I think, and makes more sense of kind of all of this. So anyhow, Haggai is a very short book. Obviously, it's right around the year 520. And this theme, as you've been going through the Old Testament prophets with me, we have seen before. So kind of the first real mention that we saw was David uses this phrase before the temple is built. So they've been given the promised land. David is established as king. Their city is beautiful. Their walls are built. His house is amazing, and the phrase like, how can I live in a house with paneling, with paneled walls, when God's house is still a tent? And that was when David said, like, I want to build you a temple. And God said, it can't be you, it'll be your son. And so David says, I can't build it, then I'm going to raise the money for it so that when my son steps in, he can just start building immediately. And so that's kind of the first mention of that. And then we remember a couple times throughout the different prophetic books where people said, here you are in your paneled houses while, the temple is in disarray. This is really what Haggai starts with again. So again, the big picture is God's people rescued from Egypt, spend this time in the wilderness. They finally come into the promised land. They're doing okay, and then they slowly get further and further and further away from God's way. They're taken into captivity because they've so abandoned God, so that they would learn, like, walk in God's ways. Now they're just starting to come back. Basically what happens is Babylon, the city, still exists, but the Babylonian kings have been conquered by Persia. So now it's the Persians who are kind of in control. So when we read through Daniel a couple weeks ago, where it talked about the different kings that Daniel served, the last few are Persian, not Babylonian, but they're in Babylon. Anyhow, so they're starting to come back, and there's two main characters in the narrative story for the first group that's coming back. Anybody remember the name of these two guys? One is kind of a prince or a leader, and one is a priest.
Are you talking about Darius and Joshua?
Joshua and It's a fun name that starts with a Z. Zerubbabel, yeah. So Zerubbabel is a descendant of David and a priest, and Joshua is kind of like the leader of that time. So these guys come back, and they're not really doing much with the temple, but they're back in their land, so they're all building their houses. So literally the exact same thing that was the problem at the beginning that David was so upset about, that when they started to get it wrong, they started focusing more on their house than the house of God. That accusation came, and so they're finally out of captivity, and they're literally right back to where they shouldn't be, focusing on the wrong things. So again, Haggai, is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses while this house, the house of God, lies desolate? And so, and then really kind of this, verse 6 is powerful, it's beautiful, but it's like you've sown much, but you've harvested little. You eat, but there's not enough for you to be satisfied. You drink, but there's not enough to be drunk. You put on clothing, but no one's warm. You earn, but your purse is filled with holes. And it's like you're trying to do things in your own strength. You're trying to build back up this city, this land again, but you've completely missed the whole point. The reason why this land was given to you and the reason why this land was sustained is because of me and people walking in my ways. You're not walking in my ways, so I'm not going to bless the land. So you can work your little hearts out, but you're still going to end up stuck like you're stuck, and the building you're wanting to do won't actually build. And so Haggai kind of speaks these, messages that have been spoken so many times before. Let's abandon this wrong way. Let's get back on track. And the people sort of begin to respond and say, okay, let's do this. You're right. And they kind of get to work together on this temple. And so again, into chapter 2, these two characters, Zerubbabel and Joshua, are starting to come into the story more specifically, and there's some discouragement that's setting in. Because we remember all the prophetic words about you're going to go into captivity, but when you come back, like the latter will be greater than the former, and it's like going to be so much better than what it was. Well, they're starting to put the temple together, and it is ghetto. Like, it is not nice. They don't have much money. They don't have much for resources. So they're building the temple, but it's also like not nice. And so they're discouraged, they're frustrated, and they're like, gosh, we were expecting everything to be like amazing, but it seems like things are not. So, what's kind of happening here? And so God speaks to Haggai. It seems like nothing to you, but do what I've called you to. Trust me, I'm with you. I'm the one doing this. I'm the one that will bring it. And the latter glory of this house will be greater than the former. The promise has not changed. It's just your perspective, what you see and where you are in this moment. Maybe doesn't make as much sense from where you are and from where you're standing. I'm sure most of us can identify to some extent this idea of a promise that we heard from God or a call that we heard from God, and we begin to walk into what God has asked us to do and what it looks like and what we thought it should look like, or what it is and what we thought it should be, or what it's seeming like and what we got the picture that He showed us are very different things. And there's a real understandable frustration that can be there. But again, remember, these are months and years and generations that these things are happening, and that's still true for us today. We need to remember that. Tim shared on Sunday about words that were shared about a time coming for the church that was 100 years later. Let's not forget that God's not just worried about the next 5 minutes. That He sees further than us, and He sees bigger than us. And so not only this kind of encouragement to them, can consider God, trust what He said, but also, I guess kind of a rebuke of sorts. Of the question is asked, because the clean and unclean, what you can't touch, and the priests and all this. A question is kind of asked. So if you are clean, but then you do something that makes you unclean, and then you touch something that's unclean, does that thing get unclean too? And the answer to Mosaic law is yes. So if I'm a priest and I'm clean, I've done everything, I'm not touching anything I'm supposed to touch, and then say I touch a dead body or something that you're not supposed to, a friend who dies and I'm a part of the funeral, I'm supposed to go back. I think only family they were allowed to, but I'm supposed to go back to a ritual cleansing to become clean again. But if I was to be a part of that funeral and then I come back and I take someone's offering before I've been cleansed, I have tainted that offering. Does that make sense? So this is the picture that he's bringing up to, Haggai's bringing up to these guys. And he says, it's the same way with your heart and with your life. If you're building the temple or if you're doing the work that God has called you to do, but there is an uncleanness inside of you, it affects the thing that you're trying to do. And this is absolutely still true today. If I'm wanting to minister, if I'm wanting to share a message, if I'm wanting to share a word or help or whatever, and there's an unclean in me as I'm wanting to do this, it gets on whatever it is that I'm doing. And so there's be encouraged, but also, guys, it matters how you live. It matters the heart that's behind. It matters the cleanness of your heart, the cleanness of your actions, of your intentions. And so, and again, kind of this closing idea that, be of good cheer, like hang in there. God's on our side. He's going to do it. Trust him. The end of the book. So then we come over to Zechariah. And so again, these things are happening around the same time. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, that last question where the Lord tells Haggai to question the priests, it's cool because it starts with, like, if you're holy and you touch something holy, does it make it holy? The answer is no. But if you're holy and you touch something unclean, like then it doesn't, like, then you're unclean and it makes everything. But the question started with, like, if you're doing the work of the Lord and it's holy, if you touch something, does it make it holy? No. Like, the sin and the unclean goes forth, but like only when you're doing God's work does what you touch holy. Like, you can't touch something that's not God's work and make it holy. Only God makes it holy.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That's really good.
So I thought that was cool that, like, yes, you can touch things unclean and spread the uncleanliness onto yourself, but you can't make things holy. Even if you're touching holiness and you're doing the work of the Lord, only God says what's holy. I thought that was cool where it started that way and then God explained it to them.
Yeah. So then jumping to Zechariah again, this is happening around the same time. And Zechariah is one of those books, like some of the other ones that we've read, where it's honestly just kind of bananas as you read it, because there's these stories. Did anybody get a chance to read through Zechariah? I totally encourage you to take time to go through it, because you'll be reading and you're like, what the heck is going on? Like these visions and these pictures, it's pretty fun. So there's basically 8 dreams. I think it alludes to that it was dreams, not like awake visions, but in his sleep dreams that take place. And so the first one is 4 horsemen. And they're like riding back and forth through the land, like seeing what's happening. The second one is these horns. And again, anybody remember what horns refer to? Like authority, leadership, kings, and all that. Yep. And so there's these thorns or horns that there's these different, like they're pictures of Assyria, Babylon, Persia, like these people that rose up. Because remember, the people of God were so upset that he would allow Assyria to come in and conquer. Like, they're wicked. Why would you use them? He says, they're a tool in my hand. They're going to be judged too. They are. Babylon takes them out. Well, how could you let Babylon take out, Judah, because we're your people and they're a tool in my hand. I'm going to judge them for that too. Now Babylon's gone, Persia's in. And so God's showing them, like, look, I'll use anybody I want to. It doesn't mean I'm justifying them or their actions or their ways. I'm using them as a tool in my hand. And so this picture is kind of affirming that, the horns. The third is like the tool is different, but like if you imagine it like a measuring tape or a that's measuring out like the land and the walls and the height and the width of everything. And then in the fourth one is about Joshua and these how he had these like dirty clothes, and the dirty clothes come off and the clean clothes are put on. But if you remain in like the wrong way of living, then you're going to stay with dirty clothes. So it's really a perfect tie into what we just talked about in Haggai, that same idea that what's going on in your heart, like it makes you unclean. And so to take on these new clothes that God has given you. And then in the fifth one is about these olive trees. And in this, the trees signify Zerubbabel and Joshua, and how the oil from these trees flows in. And basically it's talking about like the river of what this flows from really matters. And part of what's in there is a warning that I think is kind of a cool picture for us to consider. And if you go back and read it, this one is in chapter 4. I wonder if you would see this too. So this was my impression. Doing the will of God and wanting what God wants and pursuing righteousness and all this stuff is awesome, of course. But your intention, desire, or the way that you want to do it matters too. And the warning that's in here is don't tie the will of God, the holiness of God, the ways of God to political motivation and ways. That if you try to accomplish the will of God as a political assertion or move, that's tainted. In my mind, a really good example of this is Roman history, where you had leaders who capitalized on the idea of Christianity because it served their political desires or needs, rather than it being a sincere passion to follow God. And so there's this warning in here. You guys do what you're supposed to do, but not with the wrong heart, not from the wrong place. And then the next one is a super cool flying scroll that goes around destroying wickedness and wicked people, basically. And then the last one is, again, 4 horsemen, judgment, that kind of stuff. So what's interesting about this is the pairing of... Oh, I skipped one, I think. Oh yeah, the woman in a basket is here. And this was like signifying the wickedness of Israel and being carried off into captivity and all that stuff. But the messages of these different dreams are almost exactly the same, but they kind of go in this order. And it's mirroring the same type of message, same type of idea. It's really cool. I mean, the imagery is way out there, but it's also awesome. So then at the end of chapter 6, it changes from these pictures about these people and how they're called to live and what God has called them to do, to some familiar passages to us where it begins to talk about Jesus. And in this is where we start to see in chapter 9, behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and endowed with salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He's talked about as a humble king, and then it talks about him as shepherd in chapters 10 and 11, and him shepherding the flock, and that how he's priest, and he's priest who sits on the throne as king. And so there's messaging to the people of that day, because this is the bigger picture that's being addressed. Just like the salvation of God, the security of God for these people was He has a way and He has a people that He desires to see walk in this way, but when they don't walk in His way, there's consequences to it. And so He's saying He is a king who will shepherd the people, who will be a leader that they can trust, who will care for the flock. who will come humbly. Like he'll be that kind of leader, but for the purpose of people walking in his way. Given opportunity to walk in righteousness, given opportunity to follow him, to walk humbly with him. And there's this idea, when God's people were chosen, especially when they went into the promised land at first, they began to find their security in like the group that they belonged to. They were God's chosen people. And they stopped paying attention to what God's people look like, what God's people live like. And it was almost like their heritage. I'm Norwegian, therefore I get something. And this was kind of the idea that they had. I'm not saying it's the same thing, but as I was reading this thought came to my heart. It's uncooked, but I'll share it anyhow. There are different varying degrees of belief of this, but that God predetermined ahead of time who goes to heaven and who doesn't, and no one has any kind of control or say in why. And it creates, I believe, that what I would say is an incorrect belief about Scripture creates the same kind of attitude in the church that Israel had in this day. What I do doesn't matter. It's God. I'm his chosen person. And all I need to know is that I'm his chosen person. And so back then they would say, I'm Jewish. I'm Israelites. Today they would maybe use the word, I'm of the elect. And there's this tension of, we didn't choose him, he chose us. Absolutely, Scripture says this. God absolutely had a chosen people. There's no question. But the requirement for and on the person to live righteously, the requirement for the person to choose and to respond to Christ choosing them is absolutely also in Scripture. And whenever we see people falling away from their responsibility, chaos always follows. And so that's this message that comes through much of Zechariah is there is an opportunity for you to do what you're supposed to do, to walk in what you've been called to. I mean, so much of chapter 8 is like, there will be peace and blessing for you if. There will be victory and change for you if you walk in my way, if you walk in the way that I've called you to. And so it's a pretty fascinating a picture, I believe. And then in chapter 12, there's this promise. And really this is the promise of Christianity. It's the promise of our day. Again, if you're a highlighter in your Bible, I would really recommend highlighting chapter 12, verse 10 for sure. Let me just read it. I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication. Now consider both of those things, grace and supplication, so that they will look on me whom they have pierced, speaking of Jesus, obviously foretelling, and they will mourn for him, as one mourns for an only son. And they will weep bitterly over him, like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. His promise is that he will pour out his spirit on people so that they will understand what a wicked thing it is to pierce, to crucify Christ. So part of the promise of the Messiah, part of the promise of God to his church, to his, especially today, since Christ has come and since the Spirit has been poured out, is a grace to weep for wickedness, a grace to mourn for sin, and a grace to bitterly weep for what is not right. And that's not an exciting sermon, but it's the truth. And that's much of what's being said in this, what's being explained in this passage, and in this book, is it's not about you getting your land back. It's not about you getting your house. It's not even about you having this beautiful temple that you can go to. It's not about your country being restored. It's about my name. It's about my people walking in my way and turning from the way that isn't me. And in large part, no one's getting it. The same things they struggled with before captivity in Babylon, they're still doing. The same things they weren't hearing that the prophets before were warning, hey, if you're not careful, this is what you're going to fall into. They're walking right back into, and the grace of God is still allowing them to come back into the promised land. And then, really the end of Zechariah is again speaking to the prophetic future of Christ. The Lord will be king over all the earth, and in that day the Lord will be the only one, and his name the only one. And so, again, another really powerful book with some strange imagery, but some really, really important messaging in there as well. So any thoughts on Haggai or Zechariah before we move on to, as Charlie Sweet says, Malichi?
I just thought it was interesting that, this really stuck out to me. I've read Zechariah before, but it's kind of an odd thing. Zechariah 4 verse 1, when, the Lord is speaking to him, but then it says, the angel who talked to me came again and woke me like a man who was awakened out of his sleep. And I read it like wait, was Zechariah woken, like it wasn't a dream, or was the angel also like awakened and they came to talk to him like God sent him to tell him? So I don't know, I just read it in a different way, and I kind of had that question, like, was it him who was just awoken, or was the angel also came to him like a man who was also like, I don't
Interesting.
know.
Yeah, I always read it as it was him being woken up, but I have to go back and look at it.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
I just thought of it like, especially in light of like the things that we're talking about and the prophecies and things happening, like ancient things, like, and I don't know, and especially there's a lot of angel stuff that we're reading about, and I just thought that was interesting. Like, was it something that, I don't know.
Yeah.
Does that make sense what I'm saying? I thought that was, wait, I kind of want to see what that is about. I'm pretty sure it was Zechariah, but at the same time,
yeah, it's interesting.
That was interesting, like this angel had a task to do, and
anyway, that's cool.
It just was interesting to me. I love the book.
Yeah.
So
So Malachi, you notice the time frame this is almost 100 years later. So Ezra and Nehemiah, this is kind of after or right at the end. All of that whole story has taken place. So the temple of Zerubbabel has been built. So I think we've talked about this, but Zerubbabel temple is built, and then not long before the time of Jesus, the temple is rebuilt again, and that's what's referred to as Herod's temple. So Herod's temple was massive. So Solomon's temple was pretty good sized. Herod's temple would swallow 5 Solomon's temples. But that's not Zerubbabel's. Zerubbabel's like the Daewoo version of like Solomon's really nice like Ferrari, but then like the Herod's one is like, I don't know, 50 Teslas taped together. I don't know. Like it's totally different what these things are. Obviously, I know a lot about cars. It was a great choice for me to use that as an analogy. So anyhow, this is much, much later, and I want us to consider for a moment, what were the things that the people of God did shortly after they came into the promised land? What did they do concerning marriage? Did they continue to follow God's way? And no, they began to marry outside of what they were supposed to. And what was a byproduct of that? The gods of those people that they married, they brought into the temple, right? So, and then they saw the progression of this and how it turned out. So of course, they would never do that again. Like, that'd be crazy, except that's exactly what they've done again. And so 100 years later, Malachi now is coming in and saying, like, you've learned nothing. You've learned nothing. You're literally doing exactly what put us in the position that we were before. Idolatry and this was mentioned before too, but more specifically here, divorce has run rampant. So you have people who are marrying people that they're not supposed to marry. and then bringing in their false gods into their home, into their temple. People are offering sacrifices of like 3-legged blind lambs instead of unblemished perfect lambs. I mean, they're bringing just the absolute worst to sacrifice. And what's worse, the priests are like, yeah, that's fine. And they're taking those sacrifices and saying, so like no one is doing what they're supposed to do. They're just caring about themselves in this janky temple that they threw together that's not nice, that they're not following any of what they're supposed to do. They're marrying whoever they want to. And then they don't like this foreign woman with this false god, and so they divorce her and they go find another one, and no one cares. So divorce is running rampant. You got these kids, these women, these false gods, all this poverty and mistreatment and horrible things that are happening. And then in chapter 3, God's purifying fire is coming. Have we heard this before? Has this perhaps been a part of the entire freaking story that we've gone through? Yes, it has. Verse 2, but who can endure the day of his coming? And who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and like a fuller's soap. He will sit as a smelter and purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, so that they may present to the Lord offerings in righteousness. So basically, we're right back kind of where we started. And then he continues, God speaking through Malachi, all the different areas and aspects to their life that they have just let go. So another one that he mentions in chapter 3, verse 8, like you're robbing God. A tithe has been a normal part of walking with God since the beginning. Everyone knows this. Everyone's supposed to practice this, and you're not. And you're robbing from him. You've robbed God in your tithes and your offerings. And so he says, look.
Mommy, that's it.
So he says to him, bring to the house of God the whole tithe. And he says, and there's also a promise so that there may be food in my house, but also test me in this. He says, because you're not giving the way that you're supposed to, you've invited a curse on yourself. There's supposed to be blessing, but you're not walking in the blessing because you're being selfish. You're robbing from God, which has consequences. And so there's curses that are on you, and you're wondering, why is this curse here? Because you're robbing from God. Like that's a big deal. And so, just all their actions, all the things they're doing. And then again, the same message. I'm refining, I'm coming in, I'm reminding you of righteousness, I'm reminding you of motivation, that matters, the intent of your heart, what's going on the inside. Again, continuing this message, it's not just what you do or that you're showing up to sacrifice, it's the type of sacrifice, the heart that you have, following his way. I'm refining to burn off the bad so that a remnant, so that a better thing would remain in the end. And it's a refining for good. And so chapter 4, verse 2, but for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings, and you will go forth and skip about like calves from the stall. Anyone ever seen a calf that's been like in a small area and then it gets opened up? It's the most adorable thing. They run out and they're just like kicking and the mom walks out all slow, but they're like so excited for freedom. It's like, this is the kind of life you're supposed to have after the refining. It's freedom. It's freedom with joy. It's freedom with silly joy of skipping like a calf that's been set out to pasture. This is the kind of life that I have for you. And then a couple little messages, again, speaking of, alluding to Jesus, alluding to John the Baptist. I'm sending an Elijah, the prophet, to speak these words. He's going to restore the hearts of the fathers, children, the hearts of the children to their fathers, so that I will not come and smite the land with a curse. And that's the end of the Old Testament. So something that's kind of interesting. The order of the Old Testament is different now than it used to be. The last books of the Old Testament used to be, they just called it the 12, and these are the prophetic books. And then the very last book was Chronicles. We call it 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It was just one book. So this was the order, the last portion of the Old Testament in its original layout format. Chronicles, if you read Kings and you read Chronicles, they're of basically the same timelines, but the difference is Kings tells all the nitty-gritty, sticky, yucky parts of like David and all these guys' lives. Chronicles doesn't. It points to the righteous king, the worshiper's heart, the correct way, the right way, the honorable way, the way of humility, the way of honor, because it's pointing out the attributes of the coming king. So the last message to the people before the hundreds of years of silence of God is the 12 and the good king. And if you flip that into the New Testament, to what's the first thing the New Testament starts with is the ultimate good king and his 12. And it's really a beautiful transition from the old to the new. And you can see this message through the Old Testament prophets, through Ezra and Nehemiah, leading up to the end of people apart from the pouring out of the Spirit of God to, yes, empower, but also to bring conviction, to bring repentance. Like they're gonna just keep doing what they've always done. But when this king comes and he establishes his reign and he pours out his Spirit, that's when the hearts of stone become hearts of flesh, that the change and the difference will come that we get to walk in today. And so that's the end of the Old Testament prophets. Any questions, comments, complaints, concerns, emotional outbursts that anybody would like to share? All right, awesome. Thank you guys. Have a great day.
We do this next week?
Yep.
Do you want us to read something
Nope.
specific? Because a few of us will.